There it is, Bitcoin law in 20 minutes flat. It took a little bit of time, but now it's up. So, what I'd like to do today is get on my horse. I want to take us through Bitcoin law, at least the bit that I can fit into today's meeting. And I'm going to go a little quick, but at the end I'm going to leave some time for questions, I promise. So this is what we're going to talk about today. Number one, money transmission on the federal level. Number two, money transmission on the state level. And number three, how to comply and avoid, sometimes avoid completely, the requirements. Now, there's more to Bitcoin law and digital currency law than just money transmission, but I only have a little bit of time today, so this is what I'm going to talk about. You've probably heard this quite a bit, FinCEN. You've heard about MSBs and regulation on the federal level. FinCEN is a bureau of the Department of the Treasury that regulates money services businesses. Their goal is to prevent money laundering, drug trafficking, and a word that you're going to hear quite a bit of today and in the future if you're in this business. You ready for it? Narco-terrorism. Narco-terrorism is the think of the children of the 21st century. And you're going to hear a lot of it from me, you're going to hear a lot of it from your lawyers if you ever hire one, and you're going to hear a lot about it from the government whenever they talk about Bitcoin, because they love talking about narco-terrorism. So, if you're an MSB, a money services business, you're required to register with FinCEN. You just log on to the website, click a few buttons, and you're registered. But from that point on, you have to collect, verify, record, report customer information. And then you have to take that information and check the identities of your customers against watch lists for terrorists, criminals, enemies of the state. To some customers, you have to deny service outright. Interestingly enough, sometimes you have to continue servicing some customers and secretly report their activity to the federal government. And you have to undergo yearly audits, but really, the upshot of this is that as a money services business, you are deputized in the war on terror, the war on narco-terrorism. You are the boots on the ground for the federal government. Now, one kind of MSB is another word that you've absolutely heard before and you're going to hear again, money transmitter. On March 18th, 2013, FinCEN published some regulatory guidance. It was not law, it doesn't have the force of law. It's FinCEN telegraphing to the United States and anybody who does business here that this is how we interpret the law. But again, it's close enough for most of us. If you're a business, you're in it to make money. You're not in it to stand up to the government, for most people. You want that to be the other guy. You want the other guy to stand up to the government, blaze the trail, and for you as a business, you're looking to actually profit from these laws and how to get around them. So, what did the guidance do? It introduced definitions and distinctions that weren't present in the Bank Secrecy Act, and I'm going to talk about those in a second. Some people say it was vague, internally inconsistent, overbroad, and some people just plain said that it misunderstood how digital currency works. I agree with that to some extent, but I think you're all going to develop your own opinions if you ever encountered with it. Now, let's get to the meat of it. Are you a money transmitter? Well, if you accept value from person A and give it to person B, the guidance says, and historically, you've been a money transmitter. So one example of that is a hosted wallet that permits you to export private keys. If you accept value from person A and then give it back to person A, not to a different person, you just give it right back to the same person at a different time or a different place, you're also a money transmitter. If you exchange digital currency for government currency, you're a money transmitter. If you exchange one digital currency for another, and you never touch government currency, you're still a money transmitter. And the last one, the one that really caught a lot of people off guard, is if you're a Bitcoin miner, and then you convert your mined coins to fiat currency, to government currency, you're a money transmitter. You're a money services business. Even if you're not acting as a business, you could be running a couple of ATI cards that you had left over from your last build in your basement. If you convert your mined coins to fiat currency, you're a money transmitter that has to register with the federal government. Now, the state level is a little bit different than the federal level. We've talked about the federal level. The state level, the states regulate money transmitters separately from the federal government. The states don't require you to just register. In fact, you can't just register in the states. You have to get a license. You have to seek a license. And it's a privilege. It's not a right. You can't just log on to a website and click a few buttons and become a money transmitter on the state level. You have to apply, and there's no guarantee that you'll be awarded a license. And just because you get a license in one state doesn't mean it's okay to do business in any other state. So, undergoing a state law analysis, you ask one question. First, must my business be licensed? Do I really need to go out and get a license? Well, so long as you service or solicit that state's citizens, no matter where you are in the world, you probably need a license. This is a concept called extraterritorial jurisdiction. Historically, if you had a brick and mortar location in a state, you had to get a license in that state. But then businesses evolved past brick and mortar servicing customers. Now, like Bitcoin businesses, except for, you've seen the Lamassu ATM out there, except for businesses with a physical presence, mostly everything exists online anyway. Some states have explicitly said, New York and Texas are a couple that have explicitly said, look, if you service our state's customers, wherever you are in the world, you have to register it with us, or you have to get a license from us. Other states have not explicitly said it publicly. Some have said it privately to some applicants that I've walked through the process. But the smart money says, for your planning purposes, you're probably going to need 48 different licenses. But the good news is that the states have not adopted FinCEN's very broad categories of a money transmitter, all those examples I gave you earlier. For a money transmitter on the state level, it's typically just a couple of different requirements. And this is the traditional sense of what a money transmitter is. If you give value from one person, if you take value from one person and give it to another. If you take value from a person and then give it back at a different place or time. Unfortunately, each state has its own, and as I said, they're often Byzantine laws about what constitutes money. What does it mean to be money? And that's relevant here, right? This is a new kind of money. There's also an open question of what constitutes transmission. Most of the state laws don't even define transmission, because back when these state laws were written, we knew what money was and we knew what transmission was. But today, that's not so clear. So how do we answer that question? Well, you conduct a survey of the state's laws and you apply them to your business. You do the research. It's a state-by-state analysis. You look at the prior guidance. Sometimes there's case law. And it's relatively cheap. Unfortunately, it's largely academic, because what comes out of this is your lawyer develops an opinion and they say, look, this is what I think this state is going to say about your business. This is what I think your risks of being a regulated entity are. And that's largely academic, right? Who cares what your lawyer thinks? What matters ultimately is what the state thinks. So there's a second step you can take. You can request a ruling. They're called a no-action letter sometimes. You take that research that you did in the first step and put it into a letter. The letter says, usually it starts off with, this is what Bitcoin is. Second, this is what my business is doing with Bitcoin. Third, this is what your state law says. Fourth, this is why under your state law, what I'm doing with Bitcoin shouldn't be regulated. And the state, and also the federal government, you can do the same thing with the federal government at FinCEN, will send you back a letter sometimes. And that letter might say, hey, you're right, we agree, you don't need a license. Or it might say, no, you need a license. Either way, you likely get some certainty. But it's expensive. You have to pay lawyers to put together a letter. You have to pay for some follow-up. Letters have drafts. It can be pricey, but it permits people to sleep at night. The second question. Let's say I need a license. Will I get one? Well, again, licensing is a privilege and not a right. And some of the licensing requirements are onerous. Minimum capitalization requirements, six-figure bonding requirements per state, personal financial records of the individual owners. These are all things that you have to submit to the state to see whether you're worthy of the privilege of transmitting money in their state. This is affectionately known in the industry as the financial colonoscopy. Okay. If this sounds unappetizing to you, you're not alone. You can comply by getting registered and licensed, but it's a resource-intensive process. Or you can try to avoid these requirements, but it will take work. And there are different ways you can do it. People come to me and they say, okay, look, I want to access the US market at some point, but I don't want to do it now. I'm going to wait it out. I'm going to do business overseas. How can I do this without getting in trouble? I say, can I just geofilter IP addresses? Well, that is a question I get literally every week. And the answer is yes, absolutely, you need to geofilter IP addresses. But you should be doing more. And again, you don't have to do all of this. It depends on your risk tolerance. If you do none of this, again, it's just what's going to allow you to sleep at night. If you can geofilter IP addresses, that's great. You want to detect the country of residence for your customer. Then make them affirmatively state that, yes, this country that you've detected, we'll call it Canada, is my jurisdiction of residence. Then ask for a phone bill, ask for a utility bill. And that's a good start. But beyond that, you should develop policies and procedures that actually help you gauge the probability that your customer is actually a US customer or is not a US customer. To continue the example, a Canadian resident. Maybe they signed up with a Canadian IP and maybe they sent you an address from they sent you a utility bill from some property they own in Canada, but did they then go and register a US bank account with your business? Maybe they didn't register their own bank account, but they end up sending wire transfers to a US bank account. Or maybe after registering with a Canadian IP, they start accessing your service from a US IP address. These are all indicators that you're in fact dealing with a US resident. And you might want to consider terminating their account. But beyond just setting up these policies, it's important that they're actually implemented. And I don't mean, you go through the motions. I mean that every once in a while, you should catch someone. You should really catch someone, because we all know that this is happening on our businesses. We know it's happening. And in 5 years, if God forbid you find yourself the subject of an enforcement action, what do you want your lawyer to say? Your Honor, look, we had these policies and procedures. Or do you want to say, Your Honor, we had these policies and procedures and they worked. We caught people. We actually did this stuff and proved that it was effective. What's another way? What's another compliance or avoidance strategy? You could become the agent of a bank or an existing money transmitter. You can enter into an agency agreement or a service agreement. They're titled any number of things. But it's easier said than done. Right now, money transmitters are a little hesitant to alienate their existing customer base. And that's because they have a good revenue flow already. And they have to be, understandably, a little bit worried about getting into bed with a brand new cryptocurrency that a lot of their current customers have heard associated with the black market. Banks are even tougher. Banks haven't even, as of now, as of today's date, who knows what's going to happen in a month, but most banks haven't really wrapped their arms around what risk strategies and risk mitigation strategies they need to take. So you can say, oh, I'll just become the agent of a bank or a money transmitter, and then I won't have to register with the federal government. I won't have to seek state licensure. It's easier said than done, because even if you find a money transmitter or a bank who is willing to grant their license to you, you're still going to lose a lot. When you enter into a service agreement or an agency agreement, it's going to set forth the relative rights and obligations of you and the principal. We call the bank or the money transmitters the principal, and you're their agent. Typically, the principal is going to have the bargaining leverage in that agreement. And so you're going to lose some control over the operations of your business. And no matter what, you're going to have to implement and comply with the principal's compliance requirements. And those might not be the same requirements you thought you had to satisfy or that you think are viable for your business to satisfy. What's another option? Admittedly, this is the strategy that most people take. They restructure their business to fit into an exception or to avoid the requirements entirely. There are some exceptions under the federal regulation. You can say, yes, maybe it sounds like you're doing money transmission under the definitions that I gave you earlier, but if you're doing any of these things, you're exempted. One of those things is merely providing network services to a money transmitter. We just talked about a service agreement, signing a service agreement with your principal. One way to do that, one example, is white labeling your Bitcoin exchange. If you want the bank to be the first bank to offer Bitcoin services, well, maybe you develop the exchange and you license it out to them. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. There's another exception. Physically transporting value that substitutes for currency. That means armored cars aren't money transmitters, even though technically, physically, they're actually transmitting money, right? They take money from one place, put it in a car, take it to another. But they're exempted from this. It's tough to think about, how that could apply to the digital currency world, but I took a stab at it. You guys know what cassacious coins are? You seen those? Little coins that, have a private key on them, and maybe they are value or currency that substitutes for value. Value that substitutes for currency, rather. That's one example. Operating a settlement business between money services business is another exception. If you can restructure your business to operate merely as a settlement business between MSBs, you don't have to register yourself. Or if you perform payment processing services. If you have a contract with a merchant that permits that merchant to service its customers. Either BitPay does that, Bitpagos is another company that's doing that. These are exceptions from the money transmission regulations. Last example, white labeling your product. White labeling is something you've probably heard of. You develop your product, you bring it to the cusp of launch, then instead of launching it, you sell it to somebody else or you license it to somebody else. And this is a time-honored tradition of passing the buck. Here, you're passing the regulatory burden. You're passing it on to somebody else to satisfy. Or you're passing it on to somebody else who doesn't have the regulatory burden. And this strategy means something different functionally for each different product, but it can apply to both hardware and software. For hardware, you can manufacture the hardware as an OEM and sell it to another company who sticks their branding on it. You've seen that happen with the Bitcoin ATMs. You can do it with software. License the service as a SaaS, software as a service. This is what a lot of some exchanges are doing, because they realize this whole regulatory regime that we just described is not an appetizing thing. They would rather license it to somebody else, take a monthly fee, take a revenue share or something like that, and have somebody else deal with the regulatory requirements. So today, in the short time that I had, we talked about money transmission. And that's not all there is to Bitcoin law. That's not all there is to digital currency law. But for the purposes of this talk, we're time limited. There are other considerations also on the payment side. Check cashing, check selling, and currency exchange are other regimes on the state level. They're different statutory frameworks that you might have to deal with. Ultimately, that means more reasons why you might have to get a license. But beyond the payments industry, what else exists? There's securities. How many of you guys have heard of trends and shavers? Wow, okay, not that many. So Trend and Shavers allegedly ran Bitcoin Savings and Trust, BTCST, which was, it was allegedly a Ponzi scheme. And a lot of the people in this room have probably had some involvement one way or another on one end of this scheme. He was a well-known individual in the Bitcoin space. And the SEC brought charges against Trend and Shaver. And we've learned a little bit about this case. We know that from the SEC's perspective now, investments denominated in Bitcoins are securities, and they're subject to the securities laws. For the purposes of the securities laws, Bitcoin is money. The federal judge said this. Now, this is an often overblown development. This doesn't mean that in the United States Bitcoin is money. This means for the purposes of interpreting the Securities Act, Bitcoin is money. So, if you're involved in using Bitcoins as a security, or if you're involved in dealing with securities that are denominated in Bitcoins, you're subject to the Securities Act. One interesting thing that the SEC said, not in its papers, but in a press release, that they believe unlicensed Bitcoin equities exchanges are illegal. So, for those of you that have some familiarity with this, for a very long time, companies were just issuing securities. But they weren't real securities. There was oftentimes no real company backing them up. But these securities were offered on the Bitcoin Talk web board and then sold and traded on these unlicensed exchanges. Ultimately, these exchanges, most of them have shut down, and a lot of people lost a lot of money. What else beyond securities? The CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trade Commission, hasn't officially spoken on Bitcoins yet. FinCEN has, and that's what we were talking about there. They regulate not futures and commodities, but currency. So it's unlikely that buying and selling Bitcoins are going to be regulated by CFTC. But trading Bitcoin options, hash rate futures, the more exotic things that we're starting to see now may be regulated by CFTC. So I think I kept my promise. I spoke for 20 minutes, which is about as long as anybody should have to hear a lawyer speak. So I got on my horse and I asked, and I ran through a whole bunch of topics. I realize there's a lot I didn't cover, but if there's any questions at all, I'd be happy to take them, and you get a little bit of free legal advice. Hi.
Hello. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
So I have one thing you did not cover, which is you go to the state, you present your case, and they say nothing. Then what do you do?
That's a very good question.
And how often does it happen?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We're seeing that in a couple of states now. We're seeing that from New York. We're seeing that from California, although New York is at least a little bit more communicative about it. They are, anecdotally, I'm hearing that they're just, returning applications so they don't have to deny them. The states are trying to figure this out. I met with a state regulator in August, which is, ages ago in Bitcoin time. But I spoke to her and I said, so let's say we send a letter to you and I say, this is my business. This is why I think it doesn't apply. This is why I think it's not a licensed entity, a licensed business. How long does it take for you to turn around that request? This is the request for ruling, the no action letter. How long does it take to get a no action letter? And she said, look, a traditional money transmitter, a couple of weeks. But a Bitcoin business, this is what she said. So yeah, look, you've put your, wherever you want, you put your finger right on it. This is a tough time for digital currency businesses, and the states are trying to figure it out. So what do? We wait. We put in our applications and we wait.
So you mentioned that miners, like if they sell their bitcoins for currency or for fiat, they might be an MSB. What would a miner actually have to report if they signed up?
That is a great question. Who do you KYC if you're a miner? You've been mining coins using a homemade rig, or maybe you bought something from I think BFL is here, so maybe you bought something from Butterfly Labs. And you're not an institutional miner. It's not like you end the day with a bunch of coins you have to block trade on an exchange. What do you report to the federal government? I mean, what are you supposed to report? And I gotta say, it's not very well understood. Because I don't believe that FinCEN really wrapped their arms around this particular part of the guidance, and I'm happy to say that publicly. I've said it before. Presumably, you have to determine who is your customer. And your customer could be the person on the other side of you at the exchange, but if you're using a blind exchange, you don't know who your counterparty is. And again, are they your counterparty or are they your customer? So it's a very good question, and it's something that as you can probably tell, I don't have a very direct answer to. But these are the kind of problems that we're struggling with that some people are coming up with creative solutions to.
Also, just one more question. This doesn't really apply to me, but you mentioned before that one way to avoid being regulated by or having to comply with the FinCEN regulations was to just completely avoid U.S. customers. So let's say you do that, but a couple of them get through the cracks. What would the consequences be for that if FinCEN found out?
Right. So it's really a two-part answer. You have to think of the risk of enforcement, and then you have to think of the risk of, we'll call it, a successful prosecution, and those are two different things. I think the question there, you can give a long legal question as to what are your affirmative defenses to something like this. What can you say? Oh, but Your Honor, I did this. And it's a very long answer that I'm happy to give offline. But I think you can answer that sort of with the first question, and that is the risk of enforcement. Probably pretty low. You're probably a low priority. You're one of the good actors. If you're really doing all these things, you're probably one of the good actors.
Okay, thank you.
I imagine this is going to be hard to answer, but I'll ask it anyway.
Sure.
How much does a colonoscopy cost?
Okay, that's Stuart says that's my last question, guys. I'm sorry. You can find me offline, but to address the colonoscopy issue, it can cost quite a bit, and it depends on how many states you're looking to apply to. So right now, I have clients that are looking to become licensed in just 1 or 2 states, and that's a manageable cost. The cost scales. So your bonding requirement, for example, I think you'll see today there are some bonding agents making their way around. They're telling you, look, we have underwriters for these bonds. They know your business. They're willing to underwrite these bonds, but those are cumulative requirements that are, when a bond is $50,000 up to $500,000, depending on the state, and you have to pay 2% of that. That's just you pay 2% of that on a yearly recurring cost, and that's just one of the many costs. So it's a good question. It's got a long answer. For a 48-state rollout, sure, you could escape the 6 figures, but not just for bonding. That's sort of your all-in cost. I know you want to put a finger on it. So look, I hope I was helpful. I know I ran through it, and we had a ton of questions that we couldn't get to, but please feel free to come and speak to me offline. I'm happy to help however I can.
Purse.io is a gift exchange that helps you shop on Amazon with Bitcoins and at a 6% discount. How does it work? You create an Amazon wish list, share it with Purse.io, and deposit Bitcoin equivalent to the cost of your item. You'll soon receive your item in the mail, purchased for you by someone who gets your Bitcoin in return. You must try this new service. Let's Talk Bitcoin listeners will even receive additional rewards. Visit Purse.io.